What would you do if the only thing left to your name was underwater? That was exactly where Hazel Cromwell found herself on a grey Tuesday in March, sitting across from an estate solicitor in a Pembroke, Ontario law office, while her brother held his breath and calculated his inheritance. Hazel Cromwell was 37 years old. She had spent the last 12 years teaching grade 4 at St. Andrew's Elementary in Sudbury, until the school board voted to close the school the previous June, citing declining enrollment and provincial budget pressures. The notice had come in a standard white envelope on a Friday afternoon. She had cried in her car in the parking lot, then driven home to her basement apartment and quietly begun calculating how long her savings would last. The answer was 4 months. Maybe 5 if she stopped ordering takeout. She was not supposed to be in Pembroke at all. Her grandfather, Ernest Cromwell, had died in February, and Hazel had driven 6 hours from Sudbury through a blizzard to attend the funeral. She hadn't expected to be in the will. Ernest had never spoken of money. The solicitor's name was Roland Fitch, a precise man in his 60s who wore half-moon glasses and had clearly delivered difficult news so many times that he'd learned to make his voice completely neutral. Across the table from Hazel sat her older brother, Alec Cromwell, 42, who had driven up from Toronto and still had the look of someone vaguely inconvenienced by the distance. The liquid assets, Roland began, adjusting his glasses, which total approximately $38,000, along with the registered retirement savings accounts and the 20 F-150, are bequeathed to Alec James Cromwell. Alec gave a small nod, as if confirming what he had already assumed. The entirety of the Cromwell homestead property, 175 acres in Renfrew County, inclusive of all structures, is bequeathed to Hazel Marie Cromwell. Alec made a sound that was nearly a laugh. The homestead. He looked at Hazel with something between pity and amusement. The whole lower field has been underwater since January. The ice dam on the Madawaska broke upstream and flooded the entire basin. There's barely a road left to access it. I'm aware, she said quietly. There's also this. Roland slid a sealed envelope across the table. A letter from Ernest, to be opened by Hazel alone. Alec reached for it instinctively. Roland placed a hand over it first. Alone, Alec. Those were his explicit instructions. Hazel tucked the envelope into her coat pocket. Alec leaned back and softened his voice to something approaching reasonableness. Look, I know this is emotional, but be realistic. The farmhouse roof has been leaking for 3 years. The stone barn lost part of its north wall in December. The entire lower 40 is sitting under 4 feet of river water. The county is going to start issuing remediation orders the moment the flood recedes. You'll be paying fines before you even set foot on the property. He spread his hands. There's a company called Meridian Land Solutions already calling around to affected properties in the valley. Their opening number for flood-affected land in this area is around $45,000. Cash. $45,000. Hazel turned that number over in her mind. She was 4 months from running out of savings, carrying the weight of a relationship that had ended 2 years ago and left her with nothing but debt. 45,000 felt like oxygen. But she thought of Ernest, of the summers she'd spent at the homestead as a child, learning to read the river, to identify bird calls, to pick fiddleheads along the creek edge. While Alec was in Toronto at hockey camps, Hazel had been in the Ottawa Valley with her grandfather, who had pressed a cold cup of tea into her hands one morning when she was 11 and said, simply, "The cold keeps everything honest up here, Hazel. The ground doesn't forget what people try to bury." She hadn't known what he meant then. She was beginning to wonder if she was only now supposed to find out. "I'm not selling," she said. Alec exhaled slowly. "You're being sentimental." "Probably." She picked up the deed from the table. "Thank you, Roland. I'll be in touch." She read Ernest's letter that evening, alone in her motel room off Highway 17. It was 2 handwritten pages in the looping, deliberate cursive of a man who had grown up before keyboards. He did not mention money or anything hidden. He wrote about the land itself. about why he'd never sold it when he could have, why he'd turned down the cottage developers in the 90s, why he'd mortgaged it and paid it off twice rather than let a single acre go. There are things in this ground that don't belong to anyone, but the people who stayed with it, he wrote near the end. You always stayed, Hazel. Your brother never understood that some things are worth more than their price. She folded the letter and held it for a long time. It was 2 months before the water left the lower fields. The ice dam had been catastrophic. The kind that happened once in 30 years, the locals said. Hazel had driven up in late March to stand at the edge of the county road and look across what used to be a gently sloping farm. The water was flat and brown and enormous, carrying fence posts and insulation and the occasional lawn chair from somewhere upstream. The top of the old stone barn was visible above the waterline, its xpel stark against the grey April sky. She had sat down on the guardrail and pressed her fists against her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to come out of her. A man named Darren Kemp had begun calling in early April. He introduced himself as a representative of Meridian Land Solutions and had a voice like a hand on a shoulder, warm, reasonable, professional. The initial offer of $45,000 became $55,000, then $70,000. By the time the flood barricades came down in late May, he had reached $110,000. The escalation made something cold settle in Hazel's stomach. She'd been a teacher long enough to know when someone was trying too hard to seem patient. When the county finally opened the access roads, Hazel drove out in rubber work boots and her grandfather's old canvas work jacket, still smelling faintly of wood smoke and linseed oil. The smell of the flood damage hit her first. That particular reek of river silt and rotting vegetation, and the black mold already climbing the farmhouse baseboards. She spent the first week shoveling. She ate sandwiches on the porch steps and slept in a tent pitched on the high ridge above the barn. Her friends from her teaching years sent sympathetic texts. None of them came. Alec called once to ask whether she'd reconsidered. She did not call back. On the 9th day, a grey Lexus SUV pulled up to the property line. Darren Kemp was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the deep tan of someone who spent time outdoors for reasons other than necessity. He picked his way across the wet clay toward her in shoes that were going to need replacing. Mrs. Cromwell, he offered his hand. I think it's important to have this conversation face to face. She shook his hand once, then returned to the fence post she'd been examining. I told your office I wasn't selling. I understand, but I think you're carrying a burden that doesn't have to be yours. He swept a hand toward the ruined lower field. Meridian can be on site within a week for environmental remediation. You won't have to spend another night in a tent. We're prepared to offer $130,000, and we'll absorb the county cleanup fines. Hazel looked at him. She noticed that he wasn't looking at her. His eyes kept moving to the collapsed north wall of the stone barn, the section of original fieldstone and mortar from her great-grandfather's time that had finally given way under the ice pressure. There was something in the way he looked at it, not at the damage, at the gap. Why does Meridian want this land, Mr. Kemp? He smiled without any warmth. Land development. Recreational properties in the valley have appreciated significantly. You've offered me nearly 3 times what flooded land is worth in this county. I read the assessor's report. All 12 pages. She set down the post. You're sweating in a north wind in May. Something in that barn matters to you specifically. What is it? The warmth left his face completely. You're making a mistake, Miss Cromwell. The county will levy fines for every week of delayed remediation. You have no income. I've checked public records. Your school was closed last year. You can't afford to wait me out. He turned and walked back toward the Lexus. The offer expires at the end of the month. Hazel watched him drive away, then stood for a long time staring at the collapsed north wall. The ground doesn't forget what people try to bury. She started clearing the collapsed section the following morning. The fieldstone had fallen inward, the foundation still relatively intact. She worked with a pry bar and a borrowed wheelbarrow, shifting rubble piece by piece. On the second morning, she rented a gas-powered pressure washer from the hardware store in Eganville, using it to blast thick silt and algae off the old foundation stones. It was on the third afternoon that the ground moved. The flood had saturated the earth beneath the northeast corner of the barn, and the weight of the stone rubble above it had done the rest. Hazel heard a deep, wet groan, stumbled backward, and grabbed the fence post she'd been using as a lever. The earth opened, a sinkhole roughly the size of a dining table, right at the base of the oldest section of foundation. She lay on her back in the wet clay for a moment, catching her breath. Then she crawled to the edge and shone her work light down into the opening. She had expected a drain, a septic tank, maybe the remains of an old root cellar. What she found was a door. Not a hatch, an actual wooden door set into a reinforced stone archway beneath the original foundation, sealed shut with a strip of tar paper and a heavy iron bar bracket. The tar paper had kept out the groundwater. The door itself was intact. She descended into the hole on her hands and knees, sliding down the clay sides. The iron bracket required the pry bar and everything she had. When it finally gave, the door swung inward on wooden hinges that had been greased at some point, decades ago, but still functional in the sealed cold. The room behind it was the size of a large walk-in closet, stone-lined, bone-dry. The air that came out was stale and cold and perfectly still, as though it had been breathing slowly for 80 years. On the stone shelf along the far wall were 11 sealed tin boxes, the kind that had once held loose-leaf tobacco, each soldered shut with lead sealing. Beside them were 2 heavier wooden crates, braced with iron corners. And on the floor, wrapped in oilskin cloth and tied with twine that crumbled when she touched it, was a bundle of papers. She opened the papers first. They belonged to her great-grandfather, Harold Cromwell. The pages were a ledger, columns of dates and numbers and initials, stretching from 1926 to 1932. 2 letters in a different hand were tucked inside, with a return address in Plattsburgh, New York. She didn't understand all of it yet, but she understood enough. The tin boxes, when she worked the lids open with the pry bar, contained gold sovereigns, British and Canadian, stacked in cloth pouches, dozens of them. The wooden crates contained something she hadn't expected. Tightly wrapped American currency, pre-war bills in 50s and 100s, packed in oilskin against moisture. She sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor and tried to breathe. Harold Cromwell had not been a farmer who lived simply because he was humble. He had been a rum runner, one of dozens of Ottawa Valley men who had moved Canadian whiskey south across the border during American Prohibition, quietly and efficiently, when it was entirely legal on the Canadian side to sell. He had been paid in gold and American cash, and when the arrangement ended, when his contacts went quiet and the money stopped moving, he had sealed it beneath his barn and told no one. Not even Ernest. Or perhaps Ernest had known and said nothing, waiting for the right person to find it. Hazel was still kneeling on the stone floor when the shadow fell across the opening above her. "I'll give you credit, Miss Cromwell." Darren's voice came down into the chamber. "I thought the flooding would push you out. I didn't expect you to actually dig." He was standing at the rim of the sinkhole. In his right hand was a hunting rifle, the kind that lived behind the seat of a pickup truck in rural Ontario. He wasn't pointing it at her yet. "My family name isn't Kemp," he said. "It's Calloway. My grandfather was Thomas Calloway, out of Plattsburgh. He ran a distribution network from 1926 to 1931. Harold Cromwell was his storage contact on the Canadian side, and when the operation ended, roughly $40,000 American dollars and a significant amount of gold went missing. Harold claimed it had been seized. My family always knew it hadn't." His voice was completely even, almost pleasant. "My grandfather went to prison in 1933. Harold retired to his farm and died in 1958 without spending a single coin of it. So you've been watching this property. For 11 years, waiting for Ernest to die. Then the flood happened, and I thought, Perfect. Force the sale, get access, excavate quietly. But you wouldn't leave. He raised the rifle slightly. Start loading the tin boxes. Pass them up to me. And don't do anything we'll both regret. Hazel's mind moved the way it had when a child was in crisis in her classroom. Fast, without panic, looking for what was already in the room. The pressure washer hose was coiled at the top of the sinkhole, its brass nozzle hanging just inside the rim. The gas motor was still running somewhere above. She had left it on. She reached for the nearest tin box, making her movements slow and deliberate. I need to reorganize these. Some of them are heavier than others. Then stack them. He took a step closer to the rim to look down into the chamber. The clay around the sinkhole edge was still completely saturated from 3 days of pressure washing. Hazel dropped to her knees, grabbed the pressure washer hose where it hung, and yanked the trigger. The jet didn't hit Darren, it hit the rim he was standing on, 3,000 psi into already waterlogged clay. The ground dissolved beneath his left foot. He lurched sideways with a shout, grabbed at nothing, and the rifle discharged as he fell. A flat crack that rolled across the empty fields and startled the crows from the cedar row. He slid into the sinkhole in a controlled avalanche of mud and gravel. Hazel pressed herself against the stone wall of the chamber. Darren landed badly, his left ankle taking the full weight at a wrong angle. The rifle bounced to the far corner of the room. He was cursing and trying to stand. He couldn't. Hazel stepped forward, picked up the rifle, and carried it to the corner behind her. Then she pulled out her phone, 1 bar of signal, and dialed 911. This is Hazel Cromwell at the Cromwell homestead on Crooked Lake Road in Renfrew County. I need the OPP and an ambulance. I have an armed intruder on my property who discharged a firearm and is unable to move. She looked at Darren, who was staring up at her from the mud, and please notify the RCMP. This is going to require federal involvement. The OPP arrived in 14 minutes. What followed was the hardest part, and nobody who tells stories like this one ever spends enough time on the hard parts. The RCMP and the Canada Revenue Agency moved immediately to freeze the assets pending investigation. Darren Calloway was charged with forcible confinement, uttering threats, and possession of a firearm for a dangerous purpose. Because he'd discharged the rifle during the commission of an offense, he was facing federal firearms charges that could add another decade to his sentence. But the gold and the currency sat in a federal evidence locker for 4 months while lawyers argued. The CRA's position was that undeclared historical assets discovered on private property were subject to forfeiture under proceeds of crime legislation. Hazel's position, argued by a Toronto property and heritage law specialist named Harvey Naismith, was that the assets were antique coins and pre-war historical currency found within a sealed structure on private land legally inherited under provincial estate law, and that the CRA had an extremely thin chain of evidence connecting them to any specific criminal act on Canadian soil. Harvey was expensive. Harvey was also right. The government settled rather than litigate. The gold sovereigns were assessed as numismatic historical items and taxed accordingly. The American currency was assessed at historical value. After federal and provincial tax, Harvey's contingency fee, and the environmental remediation Hazel had already begun funding herself, she walked out of a federal courthouse in Ottawa on a Wednesday morning in November, holding a certified check for just under $6 million. She drove straight back to the homestead. The following April, the fields were turned for the first time in 6 years. She had hired a local crew to repoint the stone barn, properly, with fieldstone and lime mortar from a heritage supplier in Perth. The farmhouse had been gutted and rebuilt inside its original shell, with new insulation, new wiring, and windows that matched the 1920s profiles exactly. The lower field, once drowned under river water, was seeded in heritage wheat. Alec arrived on a Saturday in late spring, driving a rental car instead of the F-150. He stood in the new gravel drive and looked at the farm with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something stripped of its usual certainty. Hazel, he nodded toward the restored barn. This is remarkable. You actually pulled it off. Hello, Alec. He rubbed the back of his neck. Listen, I've been thinking about the estate, about what was discovered on the property. Harold's assets were family wealth, our family. And I've got some financial pressures right now. Bridge financing coming due. And since the discovery was technically connected to the original homestead, Ernest left you the money, the RRSP and the truck, Hazel said. He left me the farm and everything on it and under it. Roland read the will twice. You were there. $6 million, Hazel. Be reasonable. She bent down, picked up a handful of the new topsoil from the raised bed beside the porch steps. Dark and rich, turned and treated, smelling of iron and rain, and held it out to him for a moment. Then she let it fall back and brushed her hands on her jeans. You told me to take $45,000 and be done with it. You told me I was being sentimental. You left this place the same as everyone else did. She looked at him evenly. The cold keeps everything honest up here, Alec, and the ground doesn't forget. She stepped up onto the porch. Safe drive back to the city. The screen door closed behind her. Inside, the kettle was on. Through the bay window, she could see the old homestead as Ernest had always seen it, the river glinting through the tree line, the fields stretching east toward the cedar row, the stone barn, standing exactly where Harold Cromwell had built it in 1919, repaired now, solid, rooted in ground that had held its secret for nearly 100 years, and given it only to the person stubborn enough to stay. The flood had come, the ice had broken, the water had risen, and for a while it had looked like the end of everything worth keeping. But all it had done was open the ground, and the ground, as it turned out, had been keeping its promise all along. If Hazel's story stayed with you, the stubbornness, the sinkhole, the mud still on her hands, when she finally turned her brother away, we want to hear from you. Would you have held on to that land when everyone told you to walk away? Or would you have taken the money and never looked back? Tell us in the comments below. And if stories like this one are the kind you want more of, please give this video a like and subscribe to claim the drama. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is worth hearing.